this really is for us going to be the first in a series of conversations that we're going to have. We just really do, as we're launching a new church, want to adopt a bit of a humble posture and a learning posture, and acknowledge that collectively as a church and individually as apprentices of Jesus, we haven't always got these conversations, and it isn't because we didn't want to even, it's just perhaps we didn't know or weren't aware. And so we just want to look at a series of conversations over the next little while, which today with Cheryl Bear kicks it off, where we can grow in our understanding of how we're to really engage society, engage the people around us. Proverbs 31 calls us to speak up and to be a voice for people that don't have a voice. Isaiah 1:17 calls us to learn to do good, to seek justice, to help the oppressed, and to fight for the rights of the vulnerable. And Jesus in Luke chapter 4, when he returned out of the desert full of the Holy Spirit, says the Holy Spirit's empowered me and he's anointed me, kind of commissioned me to bring a message of lifting burdens off the oppressed and of bringing freedom to people who are imprisoned or maybe caught in systems of slavery. And so, the Bible calls us to that as well, to say we got to be a voice for life, a voice for justice, a voice to lift oppression off where there's oppression, a voice to end systems of enslavement, whatever that might be. And so we want to have some sanctuary conversations. The first is going to be today with Dr. Cheryl Bear on how we as a church can build better relationships and build better bridges with Indigenous communities. Then on Sunday, May the 3rd, we have Ian Green with us from the UK, and he's going to talk to us on how we can properly engage our city. We're saying we want to be for the city. We want to be in favor of the city, serve and act on behalf of the city, be a positive, life-giving influence to our city. So Ian's going to just lead us in a conversation about how we can just really kind of solidify that we exist for the benefit of the city.
So good.
Then on May 17th, Preston Sprinkle is going to be with us.
Awesome.
He's a best-selling author and podcast, and just talking to us about how we as followers of Jesus and the church can engage the LGBT community, how we can walk in loving, accepting relationships with people, and just this journey of love as we walk towards Jesus. And then finally, on May the 24th, Dr. Steve Esau will be with us, and we'll say more about who these individuals are later. And he's going to talk to us on mental health, addiction, the gospel, and the power of relationship. And so over the next month, I suppose, we're going to have these conversations. There'll be learning opportunities for us, but really they're to be conversation starters. They're not the final word. They're not the last word. They're just to kind of kick it off so that we will continue having all of these conversations as we move forward, where we just say, we want to learn to move towards people in love and engage people well in love. So today, again, I'm thrilled to have Cheryl Bear with us. She's a friend of ours. We have known Cheryl for over 20 years, which sounds like a long time, but it certainly doesn't feel like that.
No.
And honestly, if I have any good understanding or perspectives on Indigenous issues, I really would attribute that all to Cheryl, to her teaching, to her example, to her patience in answering questions and helping me grow a little bit. There's a lot of us I don't know, and so I appreciate that. Chilliwack, the city we live in and the city we are called to and exist here for, Chilliwack, 8% of our population is made up of Indigenous peoples, but most of us would acknowledge that segment of our population is really sadly missing in the church. I've not done a good job. We've not done a good job of building relationships and bridges, which is really what we want to do better and why we want to have this conversation today and move that forward. Cheryl Bear, just a little bit of an intro for some of you so we have a bit of an awareness of who she is. She is from Nadle-Wooten First Nation, which is in the north central BC, just a kind of little bit west and north of Prince George. She's a speaker. She's an award-winning singer-songwriter. She's traveled hundreds of Indigenous communities, Canada and the United States, across North America, just helping them, share stories of culture. Cheryl has her doctorate degree from King's University in Los Angeles, and her doctorate work was on an approach to First Nations ministry work and helping us understand Indigenous worldview and perspective so that we could have better relationships of learning from one another, of growing together, and just whether it's relationships and churches ministering to, there would just be healthy relationships where we can learn together. So again, I am very thankful. Again, we appreciate you being here. So I'm going to open our time in prayer, and then I'm just going to turn it over to you, Cheryl, and just again, look forward to hearing. So let me just pray. Father, we do thank you that you are for us, that you are for the cities we inhabit, and you're for every person. You say it's your will that none would perish, and you call us to go into all the world and reach all the peoples. And so, Father, we thank you for that. And Lord, we do today as members of the Sanctuary Launch team, as guests, as friends, as all who've gathered here this morning. We just ask that you would help us to learn, help us to grow in understanding, help our hearts to be enlarged and our minds and our understandings to be enlarged. We thank you for the good works that you've called us to, and we look forward to continue to walk forward towards people and love them well with the love of Jesus. So guide the conversation this morning and the conversations that will flow out of it. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, Cheryl Bear, again, thank you so very, very much for being here. We looking forward to this for a while. So I'll turn it over to you and look forward to hearing what you have to say, and then we'll have some question and answers afterwards.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, you guys. This is so fun to be in your company. I'm in Prince George right now, so it's Zoom is interesting. It's an interesting way to have to do business these strange days, but I'm grateful that I can be with you. And especially good to see Ken and Grandma Eunice, as my boys call her. Lovely to see you again. Always happy to see you guys. And of course, Scott and Naomi, my dear friends. Good to see you guys. I'm happy to walk alongside you all these many years. 20 years. Oh my gosh. See this gray streak? That's from Scott. Just kidding. They're all from, no, just kidding. So I will start off officially by how we as Indigenous people introduce ourselves is I would just say, Hadi Cheryl Bear Slee, Natle Weston, Demdenu Slee. My name is Cheryl Bear, and I'm from the beautiful village of Natle. And it's part of, Natle means the place where the salmon returns. And we used to be called the Carrier Nation. So it's up in like central BC. It's a huge, big area that the Carrier Nation would take up. But we don't call ourselves that. That was a name that was given to us by French fur traders who said we were particularly good at carrying heavy loads for long distances. And I always say that I feel like they were prophetic because our people certainly have carried heavy loads for a long time. We call ourselves Daket, which means the people who travel on the water. So that's who I am. And the way that we introduce ourselves is telling, because I haven't told you, like Scott introduced me, of course, with credentials, maybe a little bit of job stuff, background, education, all that kind of stuff is it's important for sure. But for us as Indigenous people, we don't introduce ourselves with that stuff. We are identified by land. When I meet another Native person, sometimes it never comes up, the question, what do you do? Because I'll always ask, where are you from? And then if they say, oh, I'm Siksika First Nation, I'm like, okay, east of Calgary, you're what they used to call Blackfoot, but now you call Kainai, the people, the real people, And so I know a little bit who they are because of the land base. Or Haudenosaunee, and it's like, oh, that's Toronto area. Nice, And then you get a little bit of an idea who people are. So I would like to, if somebody could get on your phone or your other device and look up native-land.ca. And I'm going to go there too. Just to make sure that I got the native-land.ca. And then there's a disclaimer, right, that pops right up. You can just X that out. And then you should see something like, does that work? No, not really. Okay, doesn't really work. But you should see like a map of basically North America. So if you pop in your information in there, you pop in what city. What I like to do with folks is I like to ask them, and you can even do this later. We don't even have to do this exercise right now, but you can pop in what city where it says search. Put in Chilliwack there. Chilliwack, and then Chilliwack, British Columbia, Canada pops up. Just click on that. And then it'll zoom right in on you, on where you are. And if you're not following this, or you're, not keeping up, that's okay. If you can, another thing that I'd like you to do is, you could do this later, pop in where you were born, what town in Canada, if you were, or America, put that in there just to see whose traditional territory that you were born on, and then where you live now. And so this says Stolo. So you're on the Stolo land, and beautiful people there. And so for me to have started off, and the most important thing about me that I want to convey to everyone else in my introduction, the way that we're taught to introduce ourselves by our elders, is always by land. So if that's the most important thing that I have to get across to you guys about me, then that also points to the fact that land is like the most important thing to us. And and we'll learn a little bit later on about different values that Indigenous people have and a different view or perspective of the land. But this is really important. This is a really great key, really good tool. And one of the things that we try to do wherever I am is I will say, so now I'm in Prince George, but I would start off a meeting by introducing myself, Cheryl Bear, blah, blah. And then I would like to say, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Lheidli people, who are also Dakit, and this is their traditional territory. And this is so important to me, and it's so important to Indigenous people all over. I think you could safely say all over the world, Indigenous people have this connection to land that a lot of people always. I even heard it growing up. Somebody said, "What is the deal with you?" And of course, derogatory slang term for Native. Oh, what is the deal with you? Blah blah blah. Why do you always want your land back? And it's like those kind of questions have been asked me all my life, and and it took me a long time to. I grew up with a love for my land, for not the traditional territory, but I had to learn and and decolonize a lot of things and a lot of ways of thinking that I've been taught in regular Canadian schools in order to fully understand and embrace what it meant to have a native view of the land. So, so that land acknowledgement, you will hear that in Vancouver every time they have a meeting. Vancouver City Council, they will say we're on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. And they will start that on every single meeting in Vancouver. There are other political folks that are starting to do that more and more. I have churches that will do that as well. The church that I attend when I'm in Vancouver is Grandview, and they start every single service, their morning and evening service, with the land acknowledgement, and then and it's also in their bulletin, and so they just got all the bases covered. And some people have said to me, why is this important? Because sometimes you'll get somebody up there who's doesn't give a rip about anything. They're just reading what they're told or they were asked, and they're up there going, "We'd like to acknowledge that we're on the," and it's just monotone, and you can tell the person is like didn't have enough coffee. So, and then people are kind of embarrassed, like, oh, maybe we shouldn't do it because this is getting old and nobody cares. But I say, I sit at the back of any of those meetings, and if I hear somebody give the land acknowledgement, I feel so good, and I feel like even if it's not my territory, I feel like I'm seen. And I remember I tell the grade 6 story about when I was when my teacher, that's when you do Indigenous studies in Canada. Well, when I was a kid, I was born in '68. So the teacher gets up and says, okay, this term we're going to be studying Indians in Canada. And so me and the other Native kid in class, we looked at each other and kind of like, hey, you know, that's us. And we're kind of happy about that. And then the teacher says, immediately says, we're going to be studying the Hurons in Eastern Canada. And I was kind of like, you know, confused, like, you know, like, wait a second, I'm right here. But then the teacher, and this is of course just rattling it off, this is happening in seconds. We're going to study Indians Canada. We're going to study the Hurons in Eastern part. And I think they might be extinct. And that was his introduction to Indigenous people in Canada. So I just went from being like, hey, cool, yay, and then to what? No, you know, to being so objectified and so, and that was part of the curriculum of Canada, was to never talk about the land you're on, to almost never acknowledge the land that you're on, but to always talk about somewhere else. And of course, some people had better, different education, some systems, some teachers were different or better, but the majority just followed the curriculum and talked about stuff that was really far away, in order to give us the idea that these things didn't matter to the ground that we walk on, that the Indigenous people were somewhere else and they're somebody else's problem, the Indian problem, as we were historically known. So, so this land, this is my grade 6 experience as a kid, and just feeling like I was in those few seconds in class, I was just rendered invisible. And one of our close friends, Scott and Naomi, and Ken and Eunice, you know, Christina Dawson, going through a tough time with her and her kids just recently, if you guys remember her in prayer. But she said it best. She says, I feel like I'm a ghost in my own land. And so when I sit in a church, or I sit in a public meeting or whatever, and someone acknowledges the land, I feel like I'm seen. I sit at the back of it, wherever I am, and I feel really good about it. And I feel like I'm a human being. And so that's how important that is to me, the land acknowledgement. And now all of that to say, I really believe that, you know, we talk about this journey of reconciliation. We talk about reconciliation with Indigenous people. And it started in the heart of residential school survivors who called when they won the class action suit, when they asked for things, they didn't just ask for a load of cash, but they said that they wanted the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was part of their ask. And they also they were asking for an apology for 25 years. They finally got it. Yeah, I forgot the year. Anyway, I don't know why. Numbers just slide right out of my brain. But so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this is the word that is used by my elders, by our people, and some of the people who were horrifically victimized by an oppressive government and church system, and they are the ones asking for reconciliation. So to me, that is my mandate as an Indigenous person, to say, okay, this was really important to them to use that term, TRC. It's of course based on South Africa, we know that. But if that's important to them, then it's important to me. So in this talking about the land acknowledgement, I have to tell you that the land acknowledgement is like a first step in the journey of reconciliation. and the journey is going to take us our lives. But I would even like to say further, it's not even just a first step. It's like a baby's first step. And this is how long this journey of reconciliation is going to take. Murray Sinclair, one of the commissioners of the TRC, he said that it took us 7 generations to get to that point, where the class action suit was won and everything. He said it's going to take another 7 generations for us to heal and to be better. And I thought that was such wisdom for him to say that. And we as Christians, of course, we believe in God's heart of reconciling, us, mankind, to God, humankind to God. And we would even go further as Indigenous people and say there's a whole other, the land is also, and it's in the Bible. We've got a whole new earth going on in Revelation. We never talk about that part. But there's going to be renewal and refining for the earth as well as for us. We're all there in Revelation together. So this reconciliation, tough journey, because we are, because of the stories we've been told, because of the foundation that we have in our lives that was given to us by Canadian curriculum, Canadian or American curriculum, Canadian or American news, and also the how we live sort of in the sort of fantasy of Canada and America, and Americans tend to like romanticize us, and we're like, the stoic elder, which I'm hopefully going to get there, I guess. Maybe. We'll see. It's supposed to come with wisdom, so fingers crossed. But so the stoic elder, or the the noble warrior, or whatever, or the Sacagawea, she's my favorite. She's the one who led Lewis and Clark all the way across. And so we live in as stereotypes within American Canadian minds, but those stereotypes are often off. Of course, stereotypes means it's nothing, it's not true. And so that, but then those are like the good ones, which we sometimes can hold to, or we sometimes imagine. But then there's the whole swath of bad ones. So we statistically, Indigenous people lead the countries of, and I kind of combine the U.S. in all of this as well. I did this in my book as well, because we don't recognize the border. We have a lot of tribes, like the Kainai called the Blood Tribe in Alberta. They go right across, and they have cousins in Browning, Montana. So I'm kind of using both of those. Now, where was I? So what was the very last thing I said just before I went off on the Earth, America, Canada thing? Okay, well, it's gone. Okay, the stereotypes. I just thought, some wise elder I am. But anyway, so there's good stereotypes, and then the good sort of fantasies, which maybe they're not so good, and then there's the negative stereotypes. And where we lead the country in everything bad. We fill up the jails, we fill up the inner cities. We have the highest rate of suicide, which is in Canada, the highest rate of suicide is among youth. But in that section of youth, the majority are First Nations, when we only make up 1% of the population. So it's like, so obviously, we could have sort of a few different ways of coming to a conclusion of how that happened. How is it that we fill up the jail? Well, the stereotypes again. They're just very messed up. They're just drunks, can't handle their liquor, don't like to work, lazy, all of those, thieving, watch out for them, don't trust them. All of those stereotypes that sort of ride under the radar, and they ride in the psyche of Canada and the United States. those myths have to be dispelled, and those things have to be really looked at let's take a real honest look at this, because there is something that we deal with as Indigenous people on a daily basis. I'm not even kidding, a daily basis, and that is called systemic racism. And there's whole courses on this. I would so encourage you to just, even give yourself like a brief, do a Google search, systemic racism in Canada. And there are universities in Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC, UBC, different places that have done a lot of work on trying to change things for all people of color. And it's important. I can't go into all of that today. And another stereotype we can jump to is that Native people, even in my saying that, I've had people push back to me and say, Native people always like to play the victim, always like to, oh, woe is me, oh, poor me. We've had to deal with all this stuff, and, and aren't we sad and poor? And I would again like to push back on that and just say, I think that I'm coming from the place of, in my own personal walk, of, some serious brokenness, some serious things happening in my life, but still we stand, still we are, very resilient people. So the whole victim thing, it's a bit of a straw man. It's a bit of a way to say, to dismiss everyone taking a very serious and very strong look at the misconceptions that Canadians and Americans have of Indigenous people that has been given to us by the Canadian government. And like I said, that curriculum in Canada, it's skewed, for example, how many of us knew about the residential schools before 2009 or 2008? And I think that the class action suit was actually won in 2007, but still a lot of folks didn't hear about it until 2008. And that's when a lot of people, the majority Canadians, aside from a very, very small percentage, the majority said, what now? The what schools? Indian residential schools. It came to light. And so many people said, we never heard of it. We can't believe that happened. How did this happen in Canada? Because we have a story that we tell. We love putting the Canadian flag on our backpacks and going overseas and being like, we're not American and we're peacekeepers, we're good people. We love that stuff. And I love that stuff about Canada. But there's a lot of that is, it's almost like the residential schools survivors picked up the rock and they're like, well, here's a bit of the foundation, and it's really messy, and it's really gonna, some of it's quite horrific. Some of the stuff that happened in the residential school, some of the stuff that's happened to Indigenous people, the reasons why we got here. And there's another big study for you to take on, if you'd like, is the history of colonization and the effects of colonization. And again, this is not to say, oh, poor us. This is to say, let's reckon with the past. Let's reckon with this story that was given to us that we did not, we maybe didn't ask, better questions. So, and people always want to go, and maybe it's just our instinct to always sort of want to hope. But people always go, we have to think about the good. And you might have heard a senator saying, why can't we talk about the good things that happen in residential school? And, can't we focus on the good things? And and then also people saying, oh, we have to, excuse me, we have to remember that not everybody in the residential schools, not every teacher was bad, not every, person was bad or evil. And I know that they're maybe even having a relative in their mind who they're thinking about. But I have to say to those things, if you listen to the residential school survivors, like 99% of them had experiences that nobody should experience, from being given the policy of not education in these schools, but policy of assimilation. That's why we won the class action suit. That's why the Supreme Court of Canada said, yeah, you guys deserve this. It's because of those things. And also, so if 99% of kids, or of adults have this testimony, we probably don't even need to go there with the good stuff. Let's just reckon with the past. Let's just reckon with this stuff and face this gut-wrenching story. And so if because you guys, we all love our kids, we all love our grandkids. If you had 10 kids in the school where your kids or grandkids go to, if 10 kids came forward and said, this teacher did this thing to us, or sort of 10 kids, where there are 9 kids say that, you wouldn't say, let's just focus on the good, and it's a bad thing this teacher said, oh, these 9 kids have this terrible story. We would want justice. There would be, protests in the street to deal with this injustice. And that's how we kind of feel as Native people. Yet we often have people saying, oh, just don't focus on the bad, and you gotta forgive. That's another thing I hear a lot, and I'm kind of like, I used to hear when I was younger. Now it's completely inappropriate for people to say, you Indians, you just need to get over it. I heard that a lot in my life. Sucks. But now the Christian equivalent is, you just gotta forgive. And I feel as a Christian, I've got to say, yeah, I agree. I think forgiveness, there's all kinds of scriptures about how we need to forgive. But it doesn't mean that I don't need to seek justice. And I'm not, and I hope that you need to forgive people is not you need to just forgive and forget and move on and, leave us alone kind of a thing. So, and this is why we're here. This is why I'm sitting here in the lobby. I guess we moved into the sanctuary with all of you guys. This is awesome. It's an awesome time to be living in these days. In the we're now a few years past the TRCs. Canadians have learned so much about all of these issues, and churches are wanting to do things in a good way. And it's because of that sacrifice of a lot of Indigenous people who, it was like 25 years they were dealing with this. So taking this issue to court, and a lot of the elders passed away before they even saw the verdict, right? So if reconciliation is in the heart of God, then what does it mean for us? And our mandate as Christians and as humans. Well, learning is the first step. So I've given you a couple of things to Google, systemic racism and history of colonization. There's a lot of things. The doctrine of discovery is also something that's worth looking into, because for us, it should be called actually the Christian doctrine of discovery. And that was when Europeans first came over, they had a mandate from the monarchs in Europe. They had every, explorer / pirate. That's a whole, I watched a Netflix study on that. Anyway, won't go into that right now. But the monarchs in Europe gave a mandate. They said, if you find the land and there is no recognized monarch, then you can consider the land terra nullius, or I've heard people say terra nullius, which means the land is empty. And this is the Christian doctrine of discovery. And so those folks came over and saw Indigenous people there. And in the 1500s, you can read accounts of like Christopher Columbus and different folks having a debate because they found Indigenous people here, of course. And they had a debate as to whether or not we had a soul. The reason that they had to debate this was because that would dictate what they would then do. So if it was decided that we had a soul, then they would be obligated to send missionaries. If they decided that we didn't have a soul, then we could just be exterminated. And that's the reality. So when it was determined that we did, some pope said, yes, they have a soul, stamp, blackjack, whatever, and was determined that we had a soul. Then the next sort of way of extermination started. And it's because we're on the land, we're in the way of progress, we're in the way of all of those things. And so the second stage or second method of extermination was via assimilation and lots of different things. And of course, the two perspectives on history. I remember learning about different places where all over the world, in Asia, in South America, you hear terms all over the world. You hear terms about people who are fighting for their country. They're called freedom fighters, or they're like the heroes and stuff. And then a whole other people group will say, no, they're terrorists. And so there's two different ways that you can look on people who overseas. I remember hearing a story about Tamil tigers, and then I went to a church in London, and the main pastor, they were both from the sort of what was the warring sections back home. The assistant pastor was not a Tamil tiger, but he was a Tamil man. And he was like, we were called terrorists, but we consider ourselves freedom fighters. And I remember just the perspective spin that I had on that, sitting there with him and his family and his little tiny girl, and just thinking, wow, we all have, there's just two sides to this elephant. And so we have this completely different story. We have, as Indigenous people, we have a completely different version of history in Canada and the United States. And it's I would say it's worth it. It's so worth it to learn to do that. And I think that the blinders kind of came off, I think, Canadians when the TRC happened, when the class action suit happened, and everybody learned about the residential schools. And I tell churches all over the place where I go, I say, I have a lot more to tell you. I have a lot more things that you don't know about Indigenous people that Canada did that are still even happening today. That there's a lot more to talk about. It doesn't just stop with the residential schools and that story. So that's my introduction. There, I'm gonna have my next. No, that's the majority of what I think I'll just do. I think, how much time do I have left here? Okay, so the land. I'm going to go into a little bit of the value of land. I've talked to you about the importance of that land acknowledgement and just being seen. But so the native view of land is that, and there's a link on my Facebook page and my personal profile, I think, by Arthur Manuel, and he's a guy from he's a native guy from the interior. I forgot, he's passed away, but it's like a 45-minute lecture, and it's really good. If you could maybe grab that, Scott, off of my page and share that with everybody, that would be, it's so informative, and he just says things and knows all these facts, this very smart man. But he said, he's talking about the different value of land. He says, non-native people look at the land as a resource base. He said, you can convert that resource base by some industry, my own notes, industrial activity. This is, for example, making 2x4s. And then, you somehow get it to market and you're going to sell that. So that was an interesting term to me, that the resource base. Because and then he goes on to say that Native people look at the land in a circular way. And he says water, animals, air, it's all within a circle. It's all, and I always say, it's all connected. We're all connected. For me, thinking about Notlay and the land that, so my mom was born in Notlay. She married my dad, who's not a native, and then they moved away over to Prince George here. And my mom was really homesick, and I think that she struggled with what I would now call severe culture shock, because she's coming right up the res, moving into a very white city up in the north, and it's like still kind of the old west up here in some ways. So she had a tough time, and she would as soon as she could, she got her driver's license, and then she would just go back home like almost every weekend and a lot of days in the summer, and I would go with her. And so I would, as we drove onto the res, she would physically like relax. She would, and now I do that as well. I drive on the land, and I will even sometimes sigh out loud as I'm driving. And I wondered if that feeling would go away. When I lived there, starting in 2014, I became a counselor in Notlay. I always say, this is my political joke, not the kind of counselor that cares about people, but like the city councilor, it's a political thing. That's my politics joke. But so I became a counselor there, and I wondered if that feeling would go away, that sigh. And just because I'm driving in and out of there all the time. But it never did. I always felt that same way I did as a little kid, the way my mom felt. Like, we're home free. We made it. We're safe. And now when most people think about native land, that's not your first thought, especially as Christians. And some of the stuff that I'm going to say next, it's some things we just think about, we don't even know where they came from, but they're just there in our heart. They just kind of live. And that's what systemic racism is. It just is it's so a part of us. It's like in the foundation of Canada, we don't even know it's there. And so I'm going to have to like jackhammer some of this stuff in order to get at it. So, and I always tell people, if something comes up that makes you react, you feel bad, or you feel guilty even perhaps, the best way to combat that is to, of course, say, oh, Jesus, help us, and then to really do some good research. So when I was a kid, there was missionaries in our community at my grandpa's house. And there was a little hill that you drive down. If you're ever driving into Notlay, it's near Fort Fraser, BC, please go and visit my auntie. You drive down the hill, and her little blue house is on the right-hand side, just before the bridge. There's only one bridge in Notlay. And she would love it if you knocked on the door and said, I'm a friend of Cheryl's. She would love it. And she'll walk you out of the bridge and talk about Notlay. But the missionaries, when I was about 13 or so, they said, as we were coming in and Notlay, we could feel the oppression. And I heard that, and I was like, what? Like, am I like spiritually, like a spiritual idiot? Like, I didn't feel that. Like, I actually felt really happy coming down the hill, and the grandpa's, there's the river, there's a little mountain. And I was so confused, and I didn't realize this was a spiritual stereotype that we have, that Christians can have. And of course, this goes all the way back to Doctrine of Discovery stuff. So then I'm in another church, and somebody says to me, oh, you're Native, right? And of course, I always had, my dark hair, and summer I get really dark, winter I get a little more fair. But anyway, this person said, you're Native, right? And I said, yeah, I'm from Notlay. I was always proud to be Native. I never would deny that I was Native, even though I knew that people would change, their countenance would change. They would become, their brows would furrow, whatever, and then they cross their arms and they get very serious. And that happened when this lady, when I said, yes, I'm from Notley. And we're in a church again. I'm a teenager. She says, you're from Notley, and she says, oh, there's a lot of darkness in your community, isn't there? And so I'm like, you know what? I have no answer for that, right? I'm a kid, and I wish I could go back in time into my little 14-year-old, whatever age I was, self, and answer her question. There's a lot of darkness in your community. And I would say, yes, at night. And because that whole misconception, right? And there's reasons for that. There's reasons for, yeah, and I would just like to say on a positive note, I'm going to run out of time here before I get to even the concept of land, but that connection that we have to land is beautiful, and it's good, and it's God-given. The stories say the Creator placed us on our land. That's our stories. That's our creation story. And so we have that connection and an obligation to watch over the land, and a mandate from the Creator to care for the land. And also, we always get buried on the land. No matter where we are in the world, we always go home to be buried. And so with, you know, if you're in Vancouver, if you live in downtown Eastside Vancouver, we're going to come get you. We're going to bring you back home. You're going to be buried on the land. And we always say we've been on the land time immemorial. It's gone out of memory how long we've been connected to our traditional territory. So that being said, if we always are buried on the land, we've been there forever, then the land is literally made up of my ancestors. And that is a really deep connection as well. That it's to me, it makes it like holy ground almost. So that is part of the way that we think about the land, those different things. And the last thing that I was going to talk about was spirituality. There's a lot of misconceptions there. I guess the second last thing I was going to talk about, but the misconceptions about our spirituality and our religion, or what would be called paganism by some people. I have gone to Bible school and, you know, asked dumb questions, and how do we know our God is the one true God? And this is, you know, theology, systematic theology A, doctrine proper 101. And the answer is, well, because of God's attributes. We know God is good, God is love, God is just, all of those things. God never acts outside of those. So when you see Baal or Molech, you know that, oh, that's not God. So I remember one time somebody talking about the Cree name for God, and it was Gichi Manitou, which means the Great Spirit. And I remember right away hearing a non-native pastor right away say, oh, you can't say that, you can't use that. And we were in like a meeting with a bunch of people, and this person said that's an evil spirit and it's a false god. You can't do that. And I was like, okay, I will believe you, because you're older than me and you should know better. And I was like a 20-something, and then I started meeting different Indigenous leaders who started talking about Indigenous theology, and using like the political terms, self-determination or whatever, government, but in a Christian way, talking about self-theology or Indigenous theology. Maybe self-theology is not the greatest thing to do. We can't do this in a bubble. We need each other for sure. We need to walk alongside historically, biblically, and you know, our colleagues today in theology. I think that's the best way to do things. But these different Indigenous scholars were starting to think about the Bible in native ways. And this I went for my whole undergrad and never was asked, how do you feel about this as a native person? Never was asked that question. It never came up. 3.5 years I was there. Only maybe one pastor sort of asked about mission stuff. But the Indigenous view of God is actually really beautiful. So I started asking elders, tell me about the Creator, tell me about a creation story. And they would tell me things, and it would sound a lot like the God of the Old Testament. God is the Creator, we have to give the highest respect. Can't even say the name of Creator in the Indigenous language. And this honor, this respect, this the Creator hears our prayers, watches over us, cares for us. You know, this really beautiful, but very Old Testament, of course, signs from the Creator, and yeah. And so I started to think, oh my goodness, this is actually quite beautiful, and also a lot of ceremonies in order, like cleansing ceremonies, in order to get to the Creator. And of course, there's smoke, and there's, you know, building altars. There's all kinds of sacrifices in the Old Testament. These cleansing ceremonies that are ways to the Creator. So there are important ways to think about theology and of course Indigenous people. And it's not all like when in doubt. It used to be when in doubt, throw it out. So if there's something that you don't quite know about, you just get rid of it. And that's how Native people have always been treated. I like to talk about sort of backing this up in history a little bit into Europe and the Great Reformation. So we have, you know, of course, the big boy of the Great Reformation is Martin Luther, right? He's in Germany. He's his 99 Theses putting on the wall, the door of Wittenberg, and he is he doesn't want to, you know, start a new denomination. He just wants to reform the church. Some things that they're off. The church has gotten too powerful. They're out of control. They're getting very greedy. All of those things. So he's just trying to get things back, and he wants to put the gospel into the vernacular of the people. He wants to, because then there was the holy language Latin, and only the priests could understand it, and so they had a lot of power, and people were just, you know, at their mercy. And so anyway, so he wants to, but he's not the only guy that's out there. With the Great Reformation was not just Martin Luther. Of course, there's Calvin, there's Knox, there's Huss, there's all over Europe. This is sort of awakening is happening, and people are starting to sort of take the Bible back. So Martin Luther is the one I think I've studied probably the most. He ends up in the Wartburg. Now you're going to guess the other half of my heritage from my great pronunciation of that particular castle. And but he ends up holed up in the Wartburg for 3 years, translating the Bible into German, into common. And he goes to the pub, because that's what Germans do, and they're singing their pub songs, and he takes those songs and he puts Christian lyrics to them. And he just gives the Germans a gospel that is theirs. And this is called, actually, the concept of missiology is called contextualization. And that is placing the gospel in the context of the people. And that is, it's a beautiful concept. It still, in a lot of ways, has not really happened in Canada. There's a lot of churches who want us as Indigenous people to walk in to your church, to get saved, hallelujah, to sit in the pew, to learn the songs, to learn when to stand up, to learn how to take communion, to learn, how to tithe, do all of those things in that church's particular style, that particular liturgy. And that almost feels like it's assimilation all over again in some ways. And that's my biggest fear about this, is how do we contextualize the gospel for Native people? How do we put it in the context of the Stolo Nation? What does it mean? And so I would like to rename the Great Reformation the Great Contextualization. And I think that in some ways, like Europeans in those days, I think that they were like, hey, you know what, we've really got a handle on what it means to be Christians now. We've got the Bible in English, and that's why the King James Bible is so important to people, because it was putting the God's word into their own language. So that it was huge. So then they, of course, come over to the New World, which is to us the old world, but they come over to the new world and then they're like, hey, we have this truth. Just, listen to us. And then they don't realize they're doing the same thing that happened to them back in Europe. They're now inflicting it on us as Indigenous people here. So, yeah. And so that's my last thought. Talked about land, talked about spirituality, self-theologizing, and this. And the last thing is the whole idea of it is what do we want? I think, and a lot of people ask me, how do we win Indigenous people to Jesus? That we just and you heard me say my very controversial thing of, do we just want them in our churches? And is that going to be assimilation all over again? When churches ask me, how do we win Indigenous people for Jesus? I usually just say, you just need to stop. You just don't. And again, very controversial for a Christian who reads the Bible, and there's literally one thing Jesus told us to do: go ye therefore and preach the good news to all nations. And here's the caveat, I guess, is that it's good news. It's the good news of the gospel. And I feel like that Native people have always gotten the bad news, that we had a gospel that was, the residential schools specifically, but also the history of colonization, took the most beautiful story I have ever heard, that, for a creator so loved the world that gave his son Jesus, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but would live forever. That is the most beautiful story. And for a person who my earliest memories are standing around a grave, the earliest memories of death has stalked me my whole life. And this is the Indigenous story, not because we're so messed up, but because we're so connected. We know so many people. And so this story, life more abundantly, that's a powerful promise. That's good news. But instead of hearing that good news, Indigenous people have been given a gospel that is the gospel that was weaponized. It was used as a tool or a weapon of assimilation. So that's why I say stop. We have to maybe slow down. And a lot of Native people have faith. A lot of Native people have, there's probably more Indigenous people that have faith within my community. And if you sort of take percentages wise, I would say that, like we say, Canada is less and less a Christian nation. I would say, well, most Indigenous people have faith in God, whether they're Catholic or they're Anglican or Pentecostal or whatever. And then the other ones who maybe wouldn't say they're Christian, they believe in Creator. So there's a lot of faith within Indigenous communities. I would say majority, probably 90% of my community believes in, they're Catholic or they believe in Creator. Maybe even 100%. So I think that in the stopping and in the having patience with ourselves and with relearning the story, that's where we don't just give up. We don't just say, okay, it's hopeless. The relationship is too hard. Too much has happened. We can never fix it. There's definitely hope. There's definitely space for us to walk together, but it's going to take a lot of learning on both sides, if you will. But for sure, Christians, we have to unlearn a lot of the things that we've learned about Native people. We have to really just start from scratch. And I have jackhammered a lot of stuff through this conversation, and so I'm just going to leave you in the middle of road construction there in the thinking. So, but yeah, I guess I'm finished, but I'll turn it back over to you, Scott.
I'm glad you left it there. I mean, I would have loved to do more. I would love to keep going, but I like that you kind of ended it there, because the conversation's not done.
Yeah.
And the learning is far from done. And so, which we want to, again, this was never meant to be a one shot, we've got it, thank you. We want to learn. And so I wrote down, you said, a couple of first steps, baby steps, land acknowledgement, looking at some of those things. What could you suggest some other steps for us as sanctuary now, as a community of Jesus followers who say, we want to build bridges, we want to build relationships with the Stolo Nation, and grow together. Are there a couple other steps that you might recommend or suggest we would take?
First, in the land acknowledgement, we're thinking about and sort of changing the way that we think about our community. And I went to I was invited one time to speak at the Muskoka Mayor's annual prayer breakfast, and they invited me, and then the main guy said when we got there, and they had invited the local Mohawk chief, and the person that invited me got up and said, it wasn't until I read Cheryl's book that I realized that we should have been inviting the chief to this, a long time ago, to some of these gatherings. And then he publicly apologized to that chief. And I was kind of sitting there, and the chief and I looked at each other, and we were like, whoa, what just happened? And it was a real moment for that chief to just experience that humility and that, hey, we learned and we're changing, and we're going to invite you now from now on. So so that kind of thing, just really thinking about the local people, and maybe inviting, a good thing to do is to get to know the local chief, and of course the chief in Stolo. You guys might have really lucked out, because he's a really good man. He's a friend of mine, actually, and he's him and his wife, dear friends, and he's a Christian. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty cool. He's one of the smartest people I know as well. His name is Andrew, and Andrew Victor. So I would just get in conversation with him. Maybe Scott, you could they're like, chiefs are so busy. They're insanely busy. So, drop him an email or phone call, message, text, I don't know, and just say, hey, we're praying for you. We're here. This is what we're up to. And then invite him out, if you can, to a meeting or a native elder. One of the things that we often do, if we have a conference, we'll have an elder come in and welcome everyone to the land. And my elders, the different Indigenous leaders that I know, they talk about that's doing things in a good way. Like, there's protocols that we have as Indigenous people. We never go on to somebody else's territory without being welcomed. And so it's a beautiful thing to have the blessing of the some people say the host people of the land. To have that blessing, it's very meaningful, and it's meaningful to the Indigenous people there as well. Again, baby steps. Actually being in relationship with or a walk of reconciliation with Indigenous people. It doesn't always mean, the question I never want you all to ask is how can we help you? Don't ask that question, because that's a paternalistic standpoint, right? It's a bit of a that's part of the old story. That's part of that. We got to jackhammer that question. And that's going to be my new favorite thing to say, the jackhammer. Unearthing the foundations. But I mean, rather than how can we help you, a better question is, how can you help us? I mean, some of the stuff that I've shared with you today, it's cracking some foundations that we have as Canadians stood on for 150 years. And some of them are wrong. Some of the values that we have, some of the ideas that we have about Indigenous people, they're wrong. I always say Native people are portrayed in the media as either from the beginning, this is in Columbus's writings, we're portrayed as either dumb or scary. And if we're dumb, then we're not using the land, we don't get stuff, we can just be pushed out of the way. If we're scary, then we need to be controlled and we need to be dealt with and put in jail and whatever, right? And it's justifiable if you can view people like that. So unearthing those kind of things. So the better question is, how can we walk alongside each other? How can Indigenous people, wisdom, beauty, spirituality, values, some of those values that I talked about, they're Native values, they're more Christian than most Christians. The value of leadership, of lots of things that we can learn from Native people. So to spin that, let's spin that and just change everything.
Thank you. One other question, then I'll just maybe throw it open to the group to see if there's some questions that they have. I've been told and thought lots when a church wants to reach its community to try to think of us, not an us and a them. That we try to get rid of that kind of thinking. It's not us and them. It's we. Would that be a fair perspective as we talk about reaching and building bridges and relationships with our Indigenous communities, or is there a healthy us and them that we could foster?
Yeah, for sure. Good question. Yeah, and that's another thing that it brings up, that some people have said to me, well, let's talk about the ways that we're the same, what do we have in common? And then we could just kind of all go, yay, we're all the same, we're good, we can be in unity now. and yes, we're human, yes, we have skin, yes, we have blood, red blood, whatever. We can talk about the similarities, and that's fine, but we don't really want to, homogeny is not unity. So I always say, let's look at the ways that we're different. Let's look at the ways that we are us and them. And explore some of that stuff. Ask the tough questions. Ask the tough questions. I like throwing things out there, like saying, let's ask the question, Indians get everything for free. I get asked that question. I've been told that all my life. Oh yeah, you Indians, you get everything for free. And it's like, really? Where's all this free stuff that I'm looking for all my free stuff, but those kind of things, that's a tough statement I just threw out at you, isn't it? There's political stuff, there's we're talking about tax-free land, we're talking about reservation land, we're talking about all of those things politically. We're in the Native view of land, and those kind of things are really hard to get to. Those are the ways where we think we're us and them, and it's okay, now we got to posture ourselves. If we can get through those kind of questions, and we can talk those things out and come to an understanding of, I didn't know that. I didn't know that Native people pay a heck of a lot of taxes. I pay a lot of taxes, and it's so when we get some of those misconceptions out, that's when I think that's when the other becomes our friend, and we can walk together really, really well, getting to those tough questions. And I think that's why reconciliation, first of all, is going to take so long, but also it's going to take a lot of courage, I think. So I actually applaud any church that invites me to come and share, because it takes a lot of courage to hear this stuff and to walk alongside. So thanks.
No, thank you. Okay, we'll throw it open to the group for a few minutes if there's a couple questions. So you'll have to unmute yourself, ask your question, and then mute yourself.
Good question. What does it look like? I have to say, I haven't seen one good example yet. I've seen some become close, folks trying to walk together. So I think the best thing I can say is right now, the thing that we have to do as Indigenous people is we need to rebuild an identity and because that's the thing that's sort of been like clawed at for 500 years, depending on where you're at, Canada, US, right? That's the thing that's been torn down is Native, just the whole assimilation attempt. They just wanted us eradicated because we're in the way. So all of the things that, and I use the word a couple of times, and I have to, part of my decolonization is I have to change some of my wording. So I talked about languages being lost, and that means that, like, oh, I was kind of absent-minded or dumb and I misplaced it. You know, it's my fault. I lost my language. Whereas actually to decolonize ourselves is to change the way we talk and the way we think and say, my language was stolen. My language was ripped away from me, from my mom. And that's a tremendous loss, because identity, language is identity. So there's worldview, there is imagery and stuff, there's connection with language. And so having to rebuild that now and to rebuild my own Indigenous identity, I think we need a lot of help. I think that one of the good things that the government has been doing is in the area of arts and language. It's certainly not enough, but they're trying to sort of like what's all these different words? I forgot anyway. To bring back the languages and to bring back all of, so this building up of the Native identity. How do we foster those things? Walking alongside Chief Andrew in building up the Stola Nation and saying, you know what, this changing the story from Native people are second-class citizens, changing the perception of Native people walking around Walmart. And you guys are, that Walmart's on Native land, so I go to that Walmart to get my tax-free stuff, which is because there's nothing in Vancouver, but it's a long drive. But anyway, you're going to run into more Native people there. And so there are people actually in your community who avoid that place. They go to another one in another town because they don't want to run into the Native people there. So changing those kind of ways of being. And I think, I don't know that I could imagine a perfect future at this point, because I'm still sort of feeling the despair of the past. I have a lot of hope for the future, but I don't think we're there yet. I think and again, we might have, I appreciate your humility, Scott, in saying, you know, the perfect picture, because I remember one time Jack Hayford said that he remembers in his most of his life, when he imagined the perfect church, you know, he just, in his mind, he thought about this perfect church, and he would think about it as the cute little steeple and the white picket fence and all of these things that were very sort of Americana, but also very Euro-American, right? So, but he admitted that, and he said that in a class one time, that that was based on his own bias. And I was so proud of him when I heard him say those kind of words, because then it helped me to sort of rethink, okay, how do I decolonize my view of church? And I don't think I've ever had that white picket fence maybe imagery. We do have a little church in Notley that's kind of my, you know, it's kind of like a, I don't know, but now my version of a church that I would like to go to has a dirt floor and a fire pit. You know, so that kind of that's how decolonized I want the church to be for Native people, and that's how I think the building up of Indigenous people, putting the gospel back in the context of Native people, so just how to bring those two things together. Maybe we do it like once a month, maybe we do it once a year or whatever, but really I think the focus, I think in my mind, as far as just sort of like reading, possibly if I could read the culture in Canada and for Indigenous people, we're really in a rebuilding mode these days. That 7 generations, we're probably in the third or fourth generation in that healing process, or maybe the third. So we have a ways to go. So, but I think stuff like this, like we're doing right now, this would be a dream come true. I think that we in in any of our settings, we should strive to have Native people in leadership, Native people, you know, involved in different ways, but certainly not like tokenism, but in real tangible ways. So